but for the sake of our students who may not have had the opportunity to meet him before, let me say a few words. Shortly after receiving his PhD from Harvard in 1966, Professor Dever was appointed director of the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, Nelson Glick School of Biblical Archaeology in Jerusalem, and later director of the W.F. Albright Institute of Archaeological Research. In 1975, he joined the faculty of the Department of Oriental Studies at the University of Arizona in Tucson, where he also held an appointment in the Department of Anthropology. In the decades that followed, Professor Dever supervised a multitude of students in undergraduate and graduate level, and his students have contributed to our knowledge of the archaeology of the Holy Land in the periods ranging from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Professor Dever is well known also for his fieldwork, which is noteworthy for its methodological contributions. Throughout his career, he directed a series of excavations in Jordan and Israel, the most notable of which is probably that of the Gezer project, which was among the first in Israel to utilize a multidisciplinary approach to excavation and analysis, and the first to act as a large-scale archaeological field school. Indeed, many well-known archaeologists, some of whom are working in Cyprus today, started their archaeological field training in his projects. Professor Dever has received numerous prestigious awards and major funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, and the Smithsonian Institution. Even more impressive, however, is Professor Dever's publication record, which includes numerous excavation reports and other books, hundreds of articles and reviews in professional journals, volumes of collected essays, and semi-popular magazines. His book, Did God Have a Wife? Archaeology and Folk Religion in Ancient Israel, published in 2005, created quite a stir. His latest book, which has just been published, is entitled Beyond the Texts, an Archaeological Portrait of Ancient Israel. Writing about the book, Zion Izevit stated that Beyond the Text is the most significant, original synthesis of archaeological and biblical data relevant for understanding Israelite history produced in decades. We are very lucky that since his retirement from the University of Arizona, Professor Dever, who also holds the position of Distinguished Professor at Lycoming College in Pennsylvania, spends half of the year here in Cyprus together with his wife, Professor Pamela Gaber, and his daughter. This is, I believe, the third time that he will give a lecture here at the ARU. I am a great fan, so whenever I can catch him, I do. And I would like to sincerely thank him for accepting to speak to us tonight on his latest book, Professor Dever.
Thank you very much, Lena. It's a pleasure for Pamela and me to be back. This time we come as refugees from Trump land. Hoping that we can find asylum here in a saner country. We're happy to have our daughter Hannah here this year with us doing the Fulbright Fellowship year. And among my many students is Tom Davis, who is known to many of you as a former director of CARI. And it's good to see many, I don't say old friends any longer, friends of long standing. I'm not quite sure how the lecture was billed, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to argue that archaeologists are historians or nothing, and that for archaeologists like myself who work in the southern Levant, our responsibility is to write new and better histories of the peoples of the region. In the case of the talk this evening, Ancient Israel. Now, I should begin by an observation, something that not many have noticed. There has not been a new history of ancient Israel published in English for more than 30 years, or in any other European language, and nothing like this synthesis in nearly 80 years. And what is even more astonishing is no Israeli since the founding of the state more than 70 years ago, no biblical scholar or archaeologist has ever written a history of ancient Israel. That's astonishing. Surely this is the center for such scholarship. Now, how is one to explain this malaise? I think it's evident that we are in an historiographical crisis in the related disciplines of archaeology and biblical studies. So I want to talk a little bit this evening about what history is, who writes it, how, and why. And I want to argue that new histories will necessarily be based largely on the archaeological evidence as our primary evidence. That sounds so simple, it seems rather silly to have to say it, but it's almost revolutionary. Now, we all pay lip service to the writing of history, so why aren't we doing it? I think the problem is with our sources, and for us there are only two sources, the Hebrew Bible, for centuries until the modern period, the only source, and of course the archaeological data that has burgeoned in the last generation or so. No history can be better than its sources, and the problem is we have lost confidence, if we ever had any, in both our sources. Let's look first at biblical studies. For a very long time, biblical scholars have argued that archaeology is mute, their favorite word. In German, it's dumm. Silent, dumb, really dumb. I would say that archaeology is not mute, but historians are deaf. If you know the language and grammar and syntax of archaeology, it speaks volumes. Somebody has said, well, if you don't know Hebrew, the Hebrew Bible is mute for you. So let's drop the notion that archaeology has nothing important to say. Now, the problem is that we do recognize, even at best, the limitation of the Bible as a source of history. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. Omri was one of the most important kings of the northern kingdom in the 9th century, the founder of a very important dynasty. The book of Kings gives exactly 9 verses to poor Omri and tells us next to nothing. He was a usurper. He moved the capital to Samaria. He died, surprise, surprise, and was buried with his father. And then the usual judgment of the book of Kings. He did evil in the sight of God. That's it. And yet, for over 150 years, the Neo-Assyrian annals speak of Israel as the dynasty of Omri. So he evidently was a very important king to everybody except the biblical writers. So if you want to write a history of the Omri dynasty, would you turn to those 9 verses or to the archaeological data we now have for the early 9th century? I could easily write a whole volume without any difficulty. Let me give you another example. In the year 701, the Neo-Assyrian king Sennacherib conducted a raid in Judah. We have his own description in which he claims to have destroyed 46 walled towns. We have the pictorial reliefs of the siege of Lachish, now in the British Museum, which filled a whole room of his palace back home. And we have several different excavation projects and 10 large volumes of excavation reports. The siege of Lachish in the year 701 is the best documented battle of antiquity, and the Hebrew Bible mentions it in 1 verse and says, and I quote in full, and Sennacherib was at Lachish. Well, yes, he was. So again, if you want to write a history of the Neo-Assyrian campaigns in Judah, would you turn to that single verse or to the archaeological evidence? So all of this seems obvious, and we should understand that archaeology is rapidly becoming our better source. Now, the problem with the biblical text are numerous. I mentioned simply some of them. For many European biblical scholars who call themselves revisionist, but are often called minimalist, I call them nihilist, there is no history to be written because our sources are inadequate. That is, the Bible is not about history at all. It's about legend and saga and myth. And above all, the texts are not products of the Iron Age from 1200 to 600, the period of the Israelite settlement and monarchy. These are Hellenistic or even Roman documents, so they are too late to be of any historical value. In the view of these scholars, and I use the term lightly, these are torturous self-identification myths of the Jewish people now under Hellenistic and Roman domination. They have invented an Israel to justify who they think they are, and so there is no real Israel. Now, in the 1990s, some of the European literature began to come to light amongst biblical studies. Philip R. Davies, then of Sheffield University in 1992, wrote a book, In Search of Ancient Israel. He didn't find it because he didn't think it existed. Israel is only a literary construct of early Judaism, not an actual fact of history. He dismissed the entire archaeological evidence in one footnote, in one verse, only to say it was irrelevant. So, of course, he didn't find Israel. In 1997, Lester Grabe, an American expatriate at Hull University, wrote another book, Can a History of Israel Be Written? A series of essays. Most of the scholars said, well, no, not really anything that would be like a history. One of them, a distinguished European scholar, said, well, maybe you could try to write a history based on archaeology. Novel idea, but he said it would be only about 10 pages long. My book is 750, and it's only a prolegomena. So that's the kind of skepticism that already in the late 90s dominated the field of biblical studies. This is usually called the literary turn. That is to say, a turn away from history writing because our sources are inadequate, a turn toward purely literary analysis. So you don't ask what happened, you ask how the stories function culturally over a period of time. That's amusing and perhaps useful, but it is not history. Sometimes it's called cultural memory, and that's the current fad in biblical studies today. Now, from the very beginning of modern critical biblical studies, almost 2 centuries ago, the goal was to write better histories of ancient Israel. And yet, after 2 centuries, the goal seems more remote than ever. And frankly speaking, most biblical scholars everywhere in the world have simply given up. They are no longer interested in writing history, and that's why they haven't done it. Now, I will admit that the source is limited, but it's not useless. The thing we need to remember about the Hebrew Bible is it is not and does not purport to be an objective history of ancient Israel. There was no such thing in antiquity. That kind of academic history is no older than about the 18th century. I wonder if you know there is no word for history in the Hebrew Bible. The word never occurs because the writers don't think that they're writing anything approaching our kind of history. They're telling stories, but the stories always have a moral point. This is didactic literature. I think probably not before Thucydides and Herodotus did you have any superior form of history writing, certainly not in the Hebrew Bible. The important point to remember is that the Hebrew Bible is not a history of Israel. It is rather an idealistic portrait of what Israel would have looked like had these fellows been in charge, but they never were. History is usually said to have been written by the winners. These guys were the losers. They were a minority even in their own time. And what they did after the fall of Jerusalem in 586 was to sit down in captivity, in exile, and rewrite the history of Israel to suit their own biases. We should have known that a long time ago. It's so obvious it hardly needs mentioning. Now, I'm going to argue that given the limitations then of the biblical text, the dearth of real, reliable historical information, even at best, we should turn to the only other source that we have. And again, this should have occurred to biblicists when they realized their own sources were compromised. Why not look elsewhere? And where else except to archaeology? What other source do we have, or will we ever have? Now, archaeology, in my view, is superior as a source for history writing for many reasons. In short, by any definition, it is primary evidence. The biblical texts are all later, sometimes centuries later, sometimes 1,000 years later than the events they purport to describe. The artifact is, by definition, contemporary. Might be a few years later, a curated artifact, but it is not centuries later. The text is the description of a thing. The artifact is the thing itself. And this is what's so exciting. The Hebrew Bible has been rewritten, re-edited, interpreted again and again and again, the Hebrew Bible for more than 2,000 years. And one can scarcely strip away all the later accumulations. But the first time you lay eyes on a cooking pot in the ground and it peeks above the surface, you're the first person to see it in 2,000 years. Maybe even more, maybe 3,000 years. It has not been edited. There it is. Now, when you first see it and touch it, you begin to edit, to interpret. But until that point, it is pristine. And so, by definition, the archaeological data are more nearly eyewitness accounts, prima facie evidence, primary data. Also, remember the biblical writers limited their story to what they wanted to tell you. And you may find this odd, but you cannot wring out of the biblical text any more information than there is in them. And you can ask all the questions you want to. The writers are not going to give you answers because they aren't interested. They probably knew a lot, but for them it was not important. Who were the writers of the Bible? Well, they were all elites. They wouldn't have represented a fraction of 1% of the population of ancient Israel or Judah. They were all members of the establishment in Jerusalem, mostly the religious establishment. They were all men. Do you think if women had written part of the Bible, it would have been any better? Oh, yes, a lot better. So we have the view of a handful of elites of what Israel might have been, not a description of what it actually was. So the Bible is severely limited in the topics that it covers, even at best. Archaeology, by definition, is unlimited. Let me put it this way. I would think in the 50 years since I finished my PhD, and it has been more than 50 years, we know at least 10 times what was known when I was a student about ancient Israel. Meanwhile, I cannot think of any breakthrough in biblical studies that helps us to understand the text any better than we could 50 years ago. You see, biblical scholars have the notion if we could only be more ingenious, if we could find a new theory, something truly novel, we could wring the secrets out of the biblical text. Sorry, there aren't any. We already understand the biblical text very well indeed after all of these centuries. That doesn't mean you can pick up the Bible at face value in an English translation and read it. But it does mean that scholars who are well trained in Hebrew and cognate languages and ancient Near Eastern history and culture can read the Bible with understanding. Most of the texts are not corrupt. We know what they say and what they mean, and it doesn't help us very much. So that's why I regard the archaeological evidence as superior. So the real question is, again, method, not only sources, but method. How do we relate these two sources, the only ones we have or ever will have? That's the question. Israelis often argue, the archaeologists among themselves, on whether to use the Bible or not. Rubbish. It's a question of how to use it, not whether. We welcome any text we happen to have, the biblical text as well. Bernie Knapp is here tonight. He's written a magisterial history of Cyprus, mostly without text. So why can't I? You are not burdened with the Bible. I am. I have to deal with the text. Problematic as they are, I have no choice. But I want to make the biblical text secondary evidence, as you will see. Now, I'm going to argue that what we need to do is to pay much more attention to what we shall call simply material culture, that is to say, artifacts. I was greatly pleased to discover two books published by the Museum of Natural History of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, one of them edited by a former colleague of mine at Arizona, David Kingery, and one of the books is entitled Learning from Things, Method and Theory of Material Culture Studies. And here's what Kingery says in the introduction. And this was a symposium in Washington. At the heart of this conference was the conviction that the things humankind makes and uses at any particular time and place are probably the truest representations we have of the values and meanings within a society. The study of things, material culture, is thus capable of piercing interdisciplinary boundaries and bringing forward meaningful discussions and interactions among scholars in many disparate fields. The study of things. Here's another quote from this volume. One of the authors says, "Things are historical evidence because, unlike other historical events that happened in the past, quote, Artifacts constitute the only class of historical events that occurred in the past but survive into the present. They can be re-experienced. They are authentic, primary historical material available for first-hand study. And he goes on to say that objects, artifacts, are truer than text. Think about it. Texts lie. They can and do. Most texts lie. Many texts are meant to lie, all those coming out from government centers, for instance. But artifacts do not lie. No cooking pot has ever masqueraded as a lamp. Not one. It knows exactly what it is and what it's supposed to do. So, in theory at least, we do have to interpret both text and artifacts, but it is easier to account for the bias in interpreting artifacts than it is in text. There are fewer biases at work, and they're more obvious. So we can talk about the truth of things, and that's what this book is really about. Now, I'm going to suggest some very simple ways for dealing with our two sources, text and artifacts. And these are so obvious, again, they scarcely need stating. First of all, we separate the two sources, and we investigate each independently. That's just honest scholarship. It's good, sound, historical method. Now, when I wrote this book, and I'm equally trained in biblical studies and archaeology, I had to pretend I had never heard of the Bible. Hadn't read a single story, didn't know anything about the Bible. I put it out of my mind almost totally and looked first of all at the archaeological data standing alone. Not in terms of its significance for biblical history or biblical events, but on its own. And then, after that, I looked at the biblical text using now the expertise that I was trained in and evaluated them separately and independently. And only then did I try to compare the two sources. And I would suspect that 90% of my evidence in this book comes from archaeology and only about 10% from the biblical text. And then, of course, the second thing is to evaluate both sources critically. Now, that means that I did not read the Bible as scripture, as inspired in any sense beyond the way most good literature is inspired. I tried to read it exactly as I would read a Mesopotamian text or an Egyptian text. I acknowledge that for many the Bible is scripture, but not for the historian. So what I tried to do is to sift through both sources to bring out the historical information that I felt was reliable and then begin to compare. And in that sense, to reach balanced conclusions. This book will be dismissed as a very radical book indeed. It is radical only by being centrist. That's rare enough these days. It tries to find a balanced judgment in every case. Now, how does it actually work? I developed what I call a continuum from left to right with about 5 columns. I went through every single story in the books of Numbers, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and the major prophets, and looked at every purported event that the biblical writers give us information. And then I tried to evaluate it in the light of the evidence, the external evidence from archaeology. And toward the left, there were events that I would say are proven to be wrong. The biblical writers simply didn't have enough information or were carried away by their own biases. Archaeology can prove many of these stories simply to be fictional. Way over at the other end, to the right, there are stories in the Bible which absolutely have the ring of truth about them. And here, for some reason or another, the biblical writers got it right. They were capable of being good historians on the rare occasions they attempted to be. In the middle, then, there are several columns. Possible, although we don't have enough evidence to be sure. Probable, most of the evidence points in this direction, but again, we don't have enough. And there's a broad middle column, we just don't know. We don't have any evidence. The Bible claims certain things, we have no external evidence at all. And I tried to arrange almost every single event in biblical history over 600 years in this series of very elaborate charts. I can barely read them myself. But that was what was unique and original about the book, and no one ever tried to do that. Now, if history is about sources and about methods, then surely it is about models. To do history, you need some model on which to base your work. Now, models don't lead necessarily to the truth about anything. They're heuristic devices. They're useful. They help us to manipulate the data. So what model was I going to choose? I thought about this for a very long time. By the way, most of my books have been written in a month or two, and some have been written in a couple of weeks. This one took me 5 years. And I've been working on it probably for over 60 years. All of my adult life, I have struggled with the issues in this book, and I never thought I was ready to write the book, and reviewers will say, indeed he wasn't. But that's their opinion. It's my last chance, so I had to do it. This book was published in my middle 80s. And I don't think I'll live to see the reviews, which would be just as well, because then I would have to answer them. And this way I won't have to. In any case, the model I chose was one drawn from jurisprudence. And here's the way it works. And again, it's quite simple. The text is the defendant. What we want to know is if it is true, if it's innocent or guilty. We want to know the same thing about the artifact. So the two classes of as evidence, our sources, are the defendants. And I use the term, we cannot take either at face value. We have to interrogate these sources. And what we want to know is, are they true? Secondly, there is, of course, the jury. And in this case, the jury is context. The whole context of the ancient world in which these artifacts and texts came to be, and the context of later scholarship, the whole history. The broad context without which we can't understand anything. And what about the attorneys? There is a prosecuting attorney and a defense attorney. The prosecuting attorney would be the skeptics, whom I've already mentioned, the revisionists, and others who think we can write no histories. And of course, the defense attorney would be positivist, like me, and I don't apologize for being a positivist. That's a pretty bad word these days, but it's not the worst that I've been called. I've collected them, and they're all very interesting. I am possibly the only, probably the only Nazi Zionist in the world. It takes a while to figure that one out. You can think about it. In any case, then we, of course, have to have witnesses. The text and the artifact can't, they can't be their own witnesses. They could give testimony, but we need external testimony. Now think about it. If you want to ask whether a story in the Bible is true, do you just keep rereading the story? No, you have to go outside. And where would you go if not to the archaeological evidence? Our only source of an independent witness is archaeology, and so we bring archaeology into the court. And what about the judge? The judge is history, the only judge we have, over what the annals historians call la longue durée, the historical process over long periods of time. That may not be a very satisfactory judge, but it's the best we've got. It's all we can do. And finally, what is the verdict? Well, the verdict might be true, but true only in a very qualified sense. And now I want to remind you of the way the principles work. First of all, a principle of jurisprudence is presumed innocent until proven guilty. Notice, not innocent, presumed innocent. That is to say, we're not ready to make a judgment at this point. We need evidence. So that's the way I've looked at the text and the artifacts, not presuming anything initially about them, but trying to keep a genuinely open mind. The second principle would be the preponderance of the evidence. I've asked distinguished jurors, you know what that means? 51%. That's not a lot, but in some cases it's all we've got. We might want more evidence, but if this is all we've got, we use it, and if we have a little more evidence on one side than the other, that's the way we have to make a decision. That's the way the law works, at least in the Western world generally. And finally, then, the verdict would be true, but in a very limited way. In other words, we live constantly in the interstices, as it were, between doubt and faith. There is no such thing as a perfect knowledge of anything, and certainly not of the past, but some knowledge is better than none. So these are the principles I tried to work on. Now, what I would argue is that the revisionists are wrong. They argue that there are no facts, only interpretations. That, by the way, is not new. Nietzsche said that already in the 19th century, and it was said by the ancient Greek philosophers as well. So the notion that our knowledge of the truth is always limited may be disturbing, but we have to learn to live with it. Nevertheless, some approximations are closer than others. And I would argue that what we want to arrive at is some sort of existential truth, truths by which we can live, even if we cannot demonstrate them. I don't use the word proof much in the book at all. I use it only in the final sense I want to mention, and that is proof, true or false, beyond a reasonable doubt. Notice, not beyond no doubts. That is not available to us. Doubts will remain, but they are not reasonable. Therefore, on the basis of reason, the only thing we have to work with, we judge this to be true enough to give us something by which we can live. I'm sorry if that's limited, that's the best I can do. And of course, what we then want to move is from truth to meaning. If there is no truth, there is no meaning. Or is that right? I have argued that a truer history gives us a better basis on which to know who we are and what we ought to do in this world. But is it possible to find meaning in non-events? Not for me, but I'm probably not typical. And I don't need to tell you that most religious myths are just that. They're myths, but hundreds of millions of people have found meaning in them. So the whole question of meaning is extremely difficult. And again, there is no such thing as objectivity. Well, then let me move on, following the same sort of model of interrogating the text and the artifacts, because what we're doing is searching for the truth, however limited it may be, in both these sources, and then find some balanced judgment. What we really want to know is, what did the biblical writers know, and when did they know it? In 2001, I published a book by that title. The revisionists argued they knew almost nothing. I argued they knew a good deal, and they knew it early. They knew it not in the Hellenistic and Roman period, but already in the Iron Age. That is, the biblical texts are older than they're given credit for being. So, beyond that, we want to know what is left of their stories after we have revised them, and can we salvage any further meaning. So I have presented here a minimalist, it will be regarded as a minimalist history. I don't think so at all, but compared to the histories that some might try to write, it will be thought to be minimal. Now, there are, again, only two ways of approaching these really profound questions, and one is to simply be a credulist. That is, the Bible says it, so it must be true. No further investigation is needed. I lived for a long time in Tucson, Arizona. Arizona is quite a fundamentalist state, and we waited for it to secede, but it didn't, and apparently still elects people to Congress, as far as I can tell. But I remember seeing bumper stickers. I love bumper stickers, and the one I liked best was seen usually on the back of big pickup trucks with a rifle rack in the back window, driven by some local cowboy, and it went as follows: God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. You don't argue with these folks. That's it. They don't need any further investigation. They've got the truth. And if you differ with them, they will gladly kill you. But historians are by nature skeptics. And so we have to ask always, what is true, and on what basis can we believe it to be true? I want to offer just a couple of case studies, and there must be 300 of them in the book, and I'll just pick one or two to show you how I actually went about arranging things along this continuum, searching for something we might call truth, even with a capital T. First of all, a negative story. Obviously fundamental to the great epic of ancient Israel in the Bible and to Judaic and even Christian faith is the notion of the Exodus and conquest, the exodus of the Hebrew slaves from Egypt and the conquest of the land of Canaan under Joshua and others. Now, the stories in the Bible are elaborate and detailed and stretch over several books. I looked at the archaeological evidence first and then at the biblical text, and here is the bad news. It's mostly fiction. The book of Joshua is almost entirely fictitious. Of the 30 or more sites that are said in the books of Joshua and Numbers to have been destroyed, there is no evidence that a single one of them was destroyed by any oncoming Israelite forces. And to make a long story short, when you look at all of the archaeological evidence, all the way from the Egyptian Delta up through Jordan and into the West Bank and to Israel proper, there is simply no archaeological evidence in support of a unified military conquest and a great deal of evidence against it. Now, that's a drastic thing to say. This is a foundation myth. Which has proven to be extremely powerful, but it just isn't true. Sorry. However, there was in Israel a people knowing themselves as Israelites did arise on the soil of Canaan in the course of the 12th and 11th century. Most of them were displaced Canaanites, displaced geographically and ideologically. They were not newcomers, they were not invaders, but there was an Israel that did emerge in the light of history in a very specific way, just not in the way that the biblical writers have told the story. Now, there are ways you can get around that. I think there was probably a small Exodus group who really had been in Egypt and had escaped, and it all seemed quite miraculous to them. And when they wrote the history of Israel, they wrote it from their perspective. So all Israelites had been in Egypt, but in fact, few had ever been. By the way, when many Americans tell the story of America, it's the story of the Pilgrims and the Puritans. The rest are all newcomers. They don't really belong here. As we now hear. So there are ways to explain how the story came to be told, but it is largely mythological. Let me give you a positive case to make you feel a little better. According to some of the revisionists, King David was no more historical than King Arthur. But in fact, there was a David. He was a king. He had a kingdom. We can date it to the 10th century, and we now know a lot about it. For instance, in 1993, there was discovered at Tel Dan in Israel a famous stela, a victory stela in Aramaic, celebrating the victory of an Aramaic king, probably Hazael, over the kings of the north. And not only are two kings named, whom we know in the Bible, but we have a description of the dynasty of David, the house of David. So a century later, Davidic dynasty was well known and had been known for a long time. So if you need a text outside the Bible, we have. And also there is probably a reference in the famous Moabite stela found in Transjordan in the last century to this same David. And more recently, a series of small sites have been excavated that show that already by the early 10th century at the latest, there was a nascent state. Call it a kingdom if you wish. One of the most important sites is called Kiryat Keapha, and it's a barracks town built right on the Philistine border. And even the skeptics agree to the early date. We have the ceramic dates, we have the C14 dates. They're all early. It's a one-period site. And it shows that there was a state that could command men and materiel. The statehood is not about size. The state of Israel was very small. Statehood is about centralization, and here we have evidence of the centralization of power in the early 10th century, and the king on the throne would have been our David. Here is something else. According to the biblical writers, their explanation of the rise of kingship is that the Philistines, who had settled along the coast, having been here for a while, I believe, it's a stopping off point. These, of course, were Mycenaeans, Greeks, essentially, settling the coast of Palestine among the sea peoples the Egyptians refer to in the period. These people were pressing inland by the 10th century, and according to the Bible, nobody wanted a king, but eventually they decided they had to have a king like all the other people because only a king could defend them against the Philistines. And according to the biblical writers, the Judeans, although badly outnumbered and outmaneuvered, managed to prevail. And I did something which seemed so obvious, but nobody had ever done it before. I looked at all the Philistine sites along the coast and lined them up, Ashdod, Stratum 11, and so forth. And then I lined up the Judahite sites that we know that have been excavated with the appropriate stratum numbers, and I drew an approximate border, which was quite easy to draw. And as a matter of fact, it's precisely where the biblical writers put the border. And it's where the border stayed until the Philistines were destroyed in 604 by the Babylonians. So the biblical writers got it right. It really was the Philistine War that triggered the rise of the state, and Judah really did prevail in that case. On the other hand, there are stories about David conducting campaigns in Moab, which I very much doubt. I don't think there's any real evidence for that at all. And he's said to have sent large chariot forces all the way north of Damascus, way up into Syria, battling the Arameans. I very much doubt that as well. And finally, there are all the other wonderful stories about David that we can say nothing about archaeologically. Now, the story of his love affair with Bathsheba is wonderful, but what sort of evidence would you look for? I don't know. A bathtub, I suppose, on a rooftop nearby. And of David's many other exploits, we can say nothing at all. But would knowing more about these things add to our sense of history? I think not at all. We know a great deal about the Davidic state. And about David, the serial killer, it's just as well that there is nothing more to say. Almost everybody who had anything to do with him ended up dead. And as for the claim of the biblical writers that he was a man after God's own heart, God has not spoken with me recently, and I have no idea whether that's true. So a lot of it still is myth. But we have the bare bones, at least, an historical outline of an early state and of kings like David. So the stories, some of them are fantastic, others are at least in part believable. Now, I want to draw this to a close by asking questions for which I have no answers. What are the historian's responsibilities to society? Surely to tell the truth, however inconvenient it is. That is to say, our job is to debunk myth, to write better histories. And now I want to say something you'll find disturbing, perhaps. We are in a better position today to write the history of ancient Israel than the biblical writers were. And it's obvious why. We have the advantage of perspective, that we know what happened centuries earlier and centuries after, things they couldn't have known. We have a vast knowledge of the ancient Near East that was not available to them. So we can write better histories, and it's our obligation to do so, whether it seems heretical or not. But the question I want to ask is this: are truer histories better? Better for whom? Now, for the historian, there are no miracles. The historian tries to describe events and also to explain them, and to say God did it is no explanation. That will not do. Maybe he did. But as historians, we have to phrase the question differently. So we assume that our histories are better because they are truer, but better with regard to what? What is it we are trying to do? Perhaps we can explain away the ancient miracles, but I think there are some things that remain miraculous that we will never be able to understand. And the older I get, the more I believe in miracles. For one thing, it's a miracle I'm still around at this age. I find this hard to live with, but with the death of several colleagues recently, of all the archaeologists anywhere in the world, in America, Europe, or Israel, working in Israel, I am the oldest. Don't ask why I'm still here. I'm not sure. And we'll see. In any case, that's what we are supposed to be doing. Offering real explanations or events and trying to find some meaning based on a better understanding. Throughout this book, I kept remembering the famous words of Santayana. reminding us that those who don't learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat its failures. I look at the Middle East today. I've spent most of my life in the Middle East. It's home for me. And I don't need to tell you how deeply troubled the area is. Instability, volatility, accompanied by nuclear weapons, national and religious fanaticism, violence, ethnic cleansing, absolutism, fascism. It looks like the apocalypse is here. Have we learned anything from history? I'm not sure. But we have to keep trying. And this was my effort, my last effort. I waited a long time to write this book. Finally, I was persuaded by some colleagues to give it a try. No, I waited for someone else to do it, and no one thought of doing it. This is either a very brave or a very foolish book, and only time will tell. But at my age, I have nothing to gain and nothing to lose. So I gave it a shot. I think it may make a difference in both our disciplines, but it will take a long time. Very few people will understand this book. Biblical scholars will regard it as all about archaeology, and archaeologists will regard it as all about biblical studies. The Israelis will say, oh, we already knew all these things, and they won't understand I'm writing for an American audience. There will be very few reviewers competent to review it. But that's nothing new. Most reviewers are about the reviewer and not about the work at hand. So I'm prepared for some really quite nasty reviews. But they will be amusing, and at my age, I can afford to laugh. So I have done my best. That's all anyone can do. But it does matter. It matters terribly. And the history of ancient Israel matters because it has been crucial to the Western cultural tradition of which we are all a part. Civilization began in this part of the world. We must be sure that it does not come to an end here. And only history will help us. Thank you for listening and sharing my work with me. I don't know if we have time for a question, so, or whether there.
Thank you very much for this. This was marvelous, but of course I have expected nothing less.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I think everybody now will want to read this book. Is this for our library?
Buy it. I still have one child in college. It's already been sold out several times. I had trouble getting a copy myself, so apparently it's selling very well, even though I never was sure that it would. It's a different kind of book, and perhaps there was time for it. I, in fact, will give one to the library here. So again, thank you. It's a good audience. How could one miss? And I look forward to future presentations. And again, I can't tell you how good it is to be at home in Cyprus.
Let me take this opportunity to give the program of our lectures for this semester to those of you who don't have it. And also to tell you that on Saturday we have the annual workshop of the Archaeological Research Unit about our work. This will be in Greek, but I hope that most of the speakers will do their PowerPoints in English so that people can follow. If they have time to do it in English and in Greek.
Or in Greek.
Not in Greek. So those of you who don't have the programs, so please and thank you again. I don't think anybody could do it I don't think anybody could talk without a PowerPoint and slideshow.